Okay. Hello there, everybody. We are now live and on YouTube here. For those of you that are new, my name is John Lustria. I'm the Director of Education at the National Museum of Civil War Medicine, and I'm thrilled to be joined by none other than Kyle Dalton, our Membership and Development Coordinator. Welcome, Kyle.
Thanks for having me.
It's great to be with you all. I don't know if anyone noticed, we had a couple little false starts. We hit some wrong buttons, so we were live earlier, but this is the real deal. This is the official program. Glad you could join us. And I see we got a couple people already tuning in. Dylan from Illinois, Jan from Orlando, Florida, some of our longtime viewers. And Hi 61 says hi. So it's great to be with all of you today. Today, Kyle and I are going to be doing an Ask Me Anything. We'll be taking your questions on all things Civil War ambulances. That's going to be our focus. If you want to ask questions that are a little bit broader than that, feel free to. But we're going to be focusing today on Civil War ambulances. And Kyle is a great person to talk about this subject, as he spent nearly a decade doing research on Civil War ambulances between writing your thesis and giving programs for the museum. You've spent a lot of time with this subject matter, isn't that right, Kyle?
I have, yeah. I have come at it as a social historian. That's my background generally. So I tend to focus more on the experiences of the people. How were they trained? What were their lives like? Now, part of that means that I do have to look occasionally at like models of ambulances, but I'm not an object historian, so I'll do my best with those questions. Yeah, that's the background I've come with. There's a lot to say. It's a deep topic, and it's a little surprising that there isn't more about it. There's no book about ambulances or medical evacuation in the Civil War. And there's 20,000 books on Amazon about the Civil War, and none of them are about medical evacuation. You'll see occasionally like a paragraph in a general medical history or like a chapter in a book about Dr. Letterman, but nobody's actually done a book length treatment of ambulances, stretcher bearers, and how they move the wounded.
Yeah, and if you're not careful, Kyle, you might be the one to write said book. But we'll see how that goes. So anyway, we're gonna have a great time today. I will see we've already got a couple questions coming in. Thanks for sending those, and I'll say this up front. We'll get to as many as we can. Hopefully that will be all of them. But those that we can't get to during the program, we'll be sure and try and go back through and answer them in the comments. And part of the occasion for us doing this program today is we're in the midst of a fundraising campaign to restore our very own reproduction Civil War ambulance that we keep out at the Pry House. It's seen over a decade of wear and tear, and it needs some touch-ups and such. And we want it to be a usable thing. It's had kids and people climbing all over it. It's seen a lot of great use, and the hope is we're raising money to restore it back to when it was good as new. So that's part of the occasion for this. Kyle, I don't know if you want to say a little bit more about that campaign. I'm going to put a link in the comments if you feel compelled to give to that. But Kyle, maybe you can say a bit more about that campaign that we're doing.
Sure. So as John said, we've had this hands-on tool, this reproduction Rucker-style ambulance wagon for quite some time, for years. And it is really starting to kind of wear down. There's also improvements that can be made to it. It was not made to the specifications of the Rucker ambulance wagon. And that's part of what we're hoping to do, not only to repair, but to make it more accurate and keep it as one of our most valuable, if not the most valuable, hands-on item in our collection. Students use it. We like to roll it out for special events. We'll move it off-site to festivals and things. So we want to continue to have that ability and have it be a great step forward for us, a way of presenting what we have to offer to make that connection to an important story of the past. So far, you've all been very generous. We have currently, along with a grant, a generous grant from the Heart of the Civil War Heritage Area, we have now gotten to over 50% of our goal. Our goal is $20,000. We've just passed $10,000 about a week ago. And once we reach that goal, then we're going to send it to South Dakota. There's a special wagon repair facility there that has actually built and stabilized original ambulance wagons from the 19th century. So they know what they're doing. It's really the best possible source for us. It is expensive, though. It's something that we need your help with. Many of you, again, have already given very generously. We're already halfway there. If you like what you see today, if you'd like to support this, check out the link in the description and also in the comments, the pinned comment. That's your best way of supporting this mission. So that's why we're here today. But I think that's enough of the pluggables. We could probably hop right in.
I think so. And I think maybe the best place to start is at the beginning. We got a question submitted to us in advance by Patrick Vance, and he asked what the historical derivation of the term ambulance is, or where it came from. So that seems like a great place to start, is at the beginning. Where did this term come from, Kyle?
It is derived from the Latin, and its earliest use to refer to a vehicle for moving sick, wounded, or injured people is probably the 1480s. Again, when you get that far back, it's a little sketchy. You're not quite so sure how far back you can go. During the Reconquista, that's when the Christian Spanish kingdoms were fighting the Islamic Spanish kingdoms for reconquering the Spanish and Portuguese countries. 1485, there's a siege, I forget the name of it, where they did use wagons for moving wounded. And that's the first that we know of a ambulance as we think of it, with the name ambulance attached to it. It is derived from the Latin. It was in Spanish, ambulancia, although it's continental Spanish in the 1400s, so it might have been ambulancia. I'm not really sure. I'm not a Spanish historian, but that's the earliest that we know of it. It's derived from the Latin, and then its modern usage comes at the turn of the 18th to the 19th century, when I'm going to totally mess up his name, Dr. Leray of the Napoleonic forces, French Napoleonic. He fought in the French Revolution and the subsequent wars, all the way through to Waterloo, I believe. He developed a flying ambulance. And that's sort of the first modern ambulance as we think of it. Not just a wagon for moving the wounded, but an organized one. And that's where a lot of European nations derive their idea of an ambulance. And he called it an ambulance. But there's a pretty big gap between 1485 and that happening. And it's really Leray that the Civil War doctors and administrators are drawing their inspiration from. It's much more recent. It's much more organized. And it's also an example that's well known through the world.
And just quickly, when you say flying ambulance, just to make sure no one is imagining literally ambulances with wings, what do you mean by flying ambulance?
Fast moving. So they were drawn by horses. He was getting the inspiration from horse artillery, which may be a term familiar to our Civil War enthusiasts in the audience. Flying artillery is light artillery. They're smaller guns that move very fast. At least that's the idea. And he got that idea of, oh, well, we can get the wounded off the field. We can do that quickly. We'll just use that model. So he developed the earliest sort of purpose-built ambulances with permanently assigned and trained teams. And I think that was about 1805. I might be a little bit off on that date, but around there.
Gotcha. So we got a good question here from Dylan. If there's no book on ambulances and medical evacuations, what kind of sources have you found to be most useful to learning more? And have you come across any sources that weren't necessarily expected? Love that question.
That is a good question. I have a lot of citations. You have to, unfortunately, well, first of all, it depends on which side you're looking at. For the Confederacy, it's much, much harder. The records of the Confederate Medical Department were burned. And it's very clear that the commanders and politicians of the South didn't really care for an evacuation system. They saw it as a distraction. And we can talk about that in a little bit. But ultimately, what that means is what official records did exist don't exist, and there probably weren't that many to begin with. So for the South, it's much harder to research. In the North, I actually started on the political side. In 1864, there was the Ambulance Corps Act. That was a congressional piece of legislation, a law that dictated that all armies had to have ambulance corps, and that these ambulance corps had to meet certain standards. They had to wear certain insignia. They had to be trained in a certain way. It really laid it all out, and it's based on Dr. Letterman's system from 1862. But in that debate, there were a lot of politicians who were offering up arguments for why an ambulance system should exist. And there were a few commanders, not too many, because it looks really bad, who opposed the ambulance system. Again, not popular PR-wise, but they saw it as a strategic decision. The more that we put into this system, the less we're putting into the system of war, as they saw it. And in this debate, there's a lot of back and forth. And that's kind of where I started, was what are people saying at the time? From there, I expanded out and chased down official sources. And then parallel to all of that, sort of separate from that entire thing, I was looking for original documents written by stretcher bearers and ambulance drivers. As far as I know, nobody's really collected those in the past, and there's not very many of them. I mean, just knowing if you wanted to find like a diary or a journal or a memoir by a guy from a regiment, you might find one or two. The likelihood of that guy also being an ambulance driver or stretcher bearer is really low. So there just aren't that many out there, but there's more than I thought there were. So I was able to kind of collect those and really start sifting through them. And I started to notice patterns emerge in there. Those would then start to, again, that running parallel, match up with the official records. And then I could start drawing conclusions from this whole melange of things. So all over the place, and I don't know it's a long answer to a short question, newspapers, letters, personal diaries, debates in Congress, you really kind of just got to grab from everywhere because nobody's ever put them together.
Yeah, and just out of curiosity, you mentioned how there were more kind of diaries, letters, memoirs, etc., from ambulance corps people. If you had to just take a guess at how many of those, are we talking tens, or 10, 20, 30 more? What number?
Okay, so more than I thought of, but not more than you think of. I think there's maybe like 10.
Wow,
yeah, there's
so
not that many,
optimistic.
but I thought I was going to find like maybe 3. There's a great one that was published, Journal of Hayward Emmel. That one's kind of like the gold standard. He goes really in depth on his experiences on the battlefield as a stretcher bearer. There's also one at the, I want to say University of Virginia, that is a diary kept day by day by an ambulance driver that was fantastic. Others are a little bit less reliable, but can be very informative. R.M. Peck was an ambulance driver in the Western Theater. He has a really vivid account of the Battle of Pea Ridge in Arkansas. But he was writing almost 50 years after the events, and he was writing for a newspaper. So we have to kind of just, give it with a little bit of grain of salt. Like, how much of this can we really say he thoroughly remembered? Some of it seems pretty clear. He's relating directly what he saw, especially when he has these sort of visceral reactions to the broken bodies he's working with. But others, it's, when he's using dialogue, how much of that is a direct translation of what people were saying at the time, and how much is he just remembering almost 50 years later? But there's still some sources out there. Again, maybe 10 altogether.
Gotcha. And for those of you who are watching with us live, if you wanted to write any of those names down, after we finish the live broadcast, this will continue to be up on the YouTube channel. You can go back and pause and rewind and whatever and write those down.
Yeah, maybe I can drop something in the comments after we're done that has just a list of some that are accessible. Some are not accessible. I'm also going to warn you about that. Some of them are in archives in, say, the Midwest, which means I haven't actually gone and read those because you'd have to travel there physically to do it. A lot of these I didn't discover until after COVID had already hit. So I just haven't had the opportunity yet to actually dig them up. But there are others that are published sources, and I'll put those in the comments.
We had a couple people ask a question along these lines. Jan asked this in the comments, and we got another longtime viewer and one of our members, Eddie McDevitt, asked ahead of time. So Jan asked, did the Confederacy simultaneously design / build their own ambulance, or did they rely on acquiring them from the Union after battle? And Eddie asked, did Confederate forces steal Northern ambulances? And if they did they notice the improvements made over the course of the war and modify Southern ambulances to improve their function? So kind of a two-pronged question, but they're both kind of getting at some similar stuff there. So
yeah, I'll start with the first part on did they design their own ambulances? We think so. The reason that we think so, actually, John, if you could enable sharing, I can share an image of this.
Yes, let me do that.
One of the most famous surgeons of the Confederacy is Julian John Chisholm, J.J. Chisholm. And he wrote a book called The Manual of Military Surgery. It was the official document for surgeons of the Confederacy. And in that is this plate. As you can see, the credits on the left there, I got this from the Internet Archive. It's a scan of a book in the copy or in the collection of Duke University. And we can see there is a field ambulance. This image does not match known models of Union ambulances, and he identifies it as a Confederate ambulance wagon. After the war, this sketch is used in the medical and surgical history, and they just say this is a Confederate ambulance wagon. You see it's marked on the side field ambulance. We do not see that on any surviving images of Union ambulances. So it seems to suggest the Confederacy did produce some, but there couldn't have been many. There was not a lot of talk about a medical evacuation system in the Confederacy, certainly not compared to the talk that was happening in the Union. And there was no major effort to create a lot of ambulances for them. This meant that there was always a deficiency of ambulances in the South. One example, in the Union, the standard was one ambulance wagon for every 100 soldiers. They didn't always reach that, especially for armies that were deeper in the South, and especially USCT soldiers, the United States Colored Troops. They were almost always undersupplied with ambulance wagons and stretchers. But that was the ideal, and there were some forces in the field that did reach that ideal. The Army of the Potomac, by the Battle of Gettysburg, 3% of the Army of the Potomac was in the ambulance corps. So they had a robust system, and it was well supplied. Again, roughly one ambulance wagon for every 100 soldiers at the ideal. But for other forces in the Confederacy, like the Army of Mississippi, they had one ambulance wagon for every 1,000 soldiers. They were at a serious disadvantage. And many of the accounts of stretcher bearers in the South say that they weren't even given stretchers. They just didn't have anything to work with. In our collection, we have a rope stretcher that we believe was just sort of jerry-rigged, MacGyvered by forces in the field because they didn't have anything. So there was no major effort made in the South. That's partly from supply issues. Everyone knows that, the blockade was putting a strain on the Confederacy, but the Confederacy was developing other wagons. There were ordnance wagons. They just didn't put the same effort into ambulance wagons. So there's not much in the way of design for Confederate ambulances. And again, take that with a grain of salt. Medical department burned. We don't really know everything. But from the sources that survive and from the reports, and there's many reports of Confederate generals and commanders, they really didn't emphasize it that much. That does mean, though, that they did prioritize U.S. ambulance wagons. They're constantly trying to capture them. This comes on accounts from both sides. Whenever ambulance wagons are captured by the South, they will mention it in their report. You're constantly seeing, we captured 3 wagons, we captured a wagon, yada, yada, yada. John?
And if I might jump in here, I mean, that's exactly why the infamous kind of Jeb Stuart raids, once around the Union Army in 1862, and then the shenanigans in the Gettysburg campaign. It's why it's not just a PR campaign to make the Union look foolish. Part of the agenda is to get wagons and ambulances like this. That's partially why it's so important.
Yeah, I mean, they want supplies in general because, again, they are at a supply disadvantage. But especially at the 63 mark, 62, 63, that supply disadvantage is not as exaggerated as it would be by the end of the war. And they are prioritizing medical equipment, and ambulances are key among those. So they are capturing them all the time. Nobody has said in the sources that I've seen, we like the Union wagons because they're better than ours, but that may be because they just didn't have them. I haven't again seen this direct, explicit. We love the design of U.S. Army ambulance wagons, but they are prioritizing them. They are trying to capture them, and they are using them.
In the comments, we got a High61 username. High61 says, "Don't forget to hit the like button," and we appreciate that. High61, if you enjoy this and any of our videos, hitting the like button is a great, easy, free way to support us. And Dylan, whose question we spoke to earlier, he says, "Thanks for answering my question. I'm very intrigued about doing historical research, and I live in the Midwest, where some of those archival sources are that you mentioned, Kyle." So very, very exciting. Jan asked another good question. Once the Letterman system got put in place, and we should probably give a quick summary as to what that is. Once the Letterman system got put in place, how long did it take for commanding officers to recognize the importance of getting medical staff and ambulances on or very near the battlefield?
Well, that's a good question. You're right. We should define the Letterman system for anybody who doesn't know. 1862, Dr. Jonathan Letterman, major in the Army of the Potomac. He's the medical director of the Army of the Potomac, which is the main Union Army in the Virginia, Maryland, D.C. area. He institutes a system for multi-level care that starts at the moment of wounding and ends with the discharge from the Army. Today, we would call this the chain of survival. The first stage is medical evacuation. That's your stretcher bearers, your ambulances. Sorry, fire truck outside. I hope that isn't too loud. Your stretcher bearers, your ambulances. Then there's the field dressing station where first aid and triage happens. Then there's the field hospital where most major surgeries occur. And then there's the general hospital for long-term care. So that's the Letterman system. For how quickly it was instituted, well, the orders for it are issued in the summer of 1862, and it's first implemented on any scale at the Battle of Antietam in September. There are some holdups to that. Part of it is that the Army of the Potomac was merged with another army, I believe the Army of the James, and they did not have the same medical system. Am I correct on that? Is it a different army?
I believe it's the Army of Virginia.
That's it.
Not to be confused with the Confederate Army of Northern Virginia, the Union Army of Virginia that was under John Pope.
Yes, that's it, under Pope. And they didn't have the same system, and they didn't have the same infrastructure. There was also some holdups with medical supplies and ambulances. Only 3 weeks or so before, they'd fought the Second Battle of Manassas, which was a gigantic battle with many casualties. So severe that the Confederacy left their medical director to care for the wounded. So it was a big battle, and there were some holdups. So they didn't roll it out as much as they wanted to. But even this impartial system being tried for the first time on the bloodiest day of American history was very successful. They evacuated all Union wounded off the field within 24 hours. So that's pretty amazing stuff. We're talking 20,000 casualties, I think, for that battle. So it was instituted fairly quickly. The next major test it had, the first time that it is like fully implemented the way they want it to, they've got everything in place, is Battle of Fredericksburg. And newspapers at the time indicated that everybody was very happy with this. It was a PR victory for the U.S. government and for the medical department, if not an actual victory for the U.S. Army in the Civil War. And there were some pushback, and that lasted through the end of the war. There were generals in the North who said, this is a waste of our time. You constantly have people who complain, officers of the ambulance corps, that complain about how they're being sent the dregs of the Army. that people are being sent who are incapable of doing the job, or are notoriously lazy, or who don't want to be there, and that drains the morale of that organization. So that was a big problem, and that's coming from the commanders. Commanders are choosing who to send. Now, those guys were subject to review, and many of them were rejected. Dr. Letterman writes about how he was often used as a cast-off for people that the commanders didn't want. And that was kind of a way of the commanders pushing back. There were others who were more explicit about it, just saying, you can't tell me what to do with my ambulances. If I want to use them for what I need them for, and they're just sitting there, I'm going to use them for that. There are others who super support it. And then there's others who, in the words of Captain Pierce, who was a officer of the ambulance corps, there are other officers who basically don't even know it exists. They're so wrapped up with this other stuff, they're not reading these memos coming from the medical department, and they're just kind of neglecting all of that. There are backlogs of ambulance wagons waiting for paint because the quartermaster just isn't sending it out. He's like, I need these for other things. So there's a mix of people who push for it, people who push against it, and people who just kind of neglect it.
Yeah, just like there are people that skim emails now and don't totally read them. I guess there are people in the Army back then that did the same thing. Oh, wow. That's really dispiriting, which, I mean, it makes total sense. But man, that's really something, just like they're totally unaware that this, thing that we harp on a lot here at the museum as being a really groundbreaking thing. They're just totally unaware that it's happening. Oh my gosh.
And that anecdote comes to me from Benjamin Forrest, who wrote a master's thesis in Britain about this, actually, Angels in Blue. He was kind enough to share his research with me, and he found that in the National Archives. This poor dude who was so put upon, Captain Pierce, just is constantly writing letters about how he's being left behind. But it does capture a truth of the ambulance corps.
Tim asked a question. He's trying to build a 1/6 scale model of a Rucker ambulance for his 12-inch figure collection. Do you know where he could find some detailed blueprints or drawings and sketches? And maybe in the course of your answer there, you can kind of parlay this into one of the questions that I have. There were a number of different types of ambulances. Specifically, what is the one that we have that we're trying to restore, and maybe how does that fit in with some of the other ones? I know one of the big debates was 4-wheeled ambulances versus 2-wheeled ambulances, but there's obviously much more to it than that. So start off with where this person might be able to find some drawings or blueprints or something like that of the Rucker ambulance, and then we can go into the types of ambulances from there.
Sure. I'm not aware of really specific blueprints. I've seen a lot of diagrams in the Library of Congress, but they don't have measurements associated with them, and they're not to scale. So they'll have the yoke be larger than the bed, and it just doesn't work. So that can be a little frustrating. I would start with the medical and surgical history of the War of the Rebellion. If you've watched any of our videos on this channel, we mention it every time. It is the definitive guide to the U.S. medical department in the Civil War. It's all sorts of records. It's voluminous. And it used to be impossible to get a hold of. It was super expensive. It was gigantic. Now it's all over the internet and it's text searchable. They have a section in one of the series volumes and chapters that is all about ambulances and stretchers. And I know that stretchers in there are very detailed. They talk about the exact length of the poles, of the yokes, where exactly the canvas was nailed into the poles. And I'm pretty sure they have the same sort of thing for major ambulance models in there as well. If they don't, it'll at least give you general guidelines. And that's the place you're going to want to start is the sort of overall idea. Because there were many ambulance models in the war. Rucker is the most popular. Rucker was the definitive model by the end of the war. This goes into your question, John, about different ambulance models. So before the war, in the antebellum period, ambulances were generally 2-wheeled. This is because of where they were being used. Most of the fighting, most of the violence the military was involved with was in the far west. It was on the plains. It was in the deserts. It was against American Indian nations and tribes. And in those conflicts, you generally had pretty low casualties, at least compared to the Civil War, and they were in difficult to reach places. A four-wheeled ambulance wagon is kind of hard to run over the Rockies or into, Pecos Canyon. So two-wheeled ambulance wagons were much more maneuverable. And they didn't have to carry as many people because these conflicts tended to be much smaller. However, when you get to the Civil War, you're now on the comparatively flat East Coast. I can say that having moved from the Sierra Nevadas out here. I always imagined as a kid these Civil War battles where they're like, we're going to take that hill. I imagined a mountain, and instead it's just like a little ridge. So it's much easier to get around. You don't need two wheels. You've got four. That's fine. You can get up that hill. And there's also a lot more roads. It's a lot easier to transport people, and you've got much more casualties. You need to have a higher capacity. And so those ambulance wagons needed to be bigger. And that's when they expanded to the four-wheel very quickly in the first year or so of the war. They're still making and distributing two-wheeled ambulance wagons because they just need as many ambulances as they can get. But the four-wheeled is preferred. And the model that kind of comes to the top, as I mentioned earlier, is the Rucker. The Rucker becomes the Army's choice and remains the Army's choice through the Spanish-American War and into the 20th century. It is the most popular kind of wagon model. It is often misidentified in museums as a Civil War wagon because it's the same model. And you'll see that occasionally. I won't name check any museums. I'm not here to throw shade. But I have definitely been to more than one museum where a Spanish-American War ambulance is being misidentified as Civil War because it's the same model. And if you're not careful, they look very similar. So that's the most popular one. There are others that are kind of like a deluxe model. Here, I'll bring up one interesting example. This is from the Library Company of Philadelphia. And this utilizes a interesting stretcher model. Many of these ambulance wagons came with their own purpose-built stretchers. It's there's a big image, so it's downloading. Here we go. There we are. So you see the purpose-built stretchers here that have sort of almost like a sleep number bed where it kind of like folds up to accommodate whatever kind of wound you need. The wagon in the background is a two-wheeled ambulance wagon, and this is pretty late. This is 1863-ish for two-wheeled ambulance wagons to be created. But they're still happening. They're still passing these out. They're still trying different models. They're still trying to make things work. And there's many, many different wagons that are patented in this period. The Coolidge, the Tripler, the Studebaker. The one that rises to the top, though, and the one that is the most prolific by the end of the war is the Rucker. And that's what we're trying to get reproduced or repaired is our reproduction Rucker-style wagon.
And one final sort of thing on the different ambulance types, Drew asked if Studebaker manufactured ambulances during the war.
Yes, Studebaker did manufacture ambulance wagons during the war. There's one surviving model that I know of. I think it's in the Military Museum of Mississippi. I'll have to look that up again. But it does survive. So there is a full-blown existing model of this from the Civil War. We also, unlike most models, know a little bit more about how they appeared. Of course, photography back then is sepia tone, black and white. And we can make judgments on what we think a color is based on how dark it is, especially compared to other things in the image that we might know the color of. But it's all guesswork. The only one that we know for certain what it looked like is the Studebaker, because there's a receipt for paint for the Studebaker wagons that is in the Library of Congress. And our director of research, Terry Reimer, found this, was kind enough to share it with me. And it was a deep green. It was a forest green. There are other wagons, though, that may have been black. There's a surviving Rucker ambulance in the U.S. Army Quartermaster Museum that is black. We don't know if that's originally how it looked, but that's how it looks now. And the Spanish-American War model of the Rucker wagon was green. Others we think were probably wood that was just varnished, so it had the wood coloring to it. But yeah, Studebaker did make ambulance wagons during the war, a few thousand of them, and we know what they look like, which is unusual.
Indeed. Um, well, actually, just quickly before I do a slight change of topic, Jan asked, and this might have something to do with finding diagrams and such. Jan asks, are all of the ambulance designs patented? Because if so, I would imagine, an enterprising person could go and find those. Do you know anything about that, Kyle?
Oh, I do know that all the ambulance models for the North that we know of are patented, but those are the ones we know of. There may have been some that weren't, but yeah, that's a good point. Actually, I hadn't even thought of that. The patents would be really good. Google does have a system that they don't really keep up, but is pretty thorough and kind of hard to navigate, where you can bring up old patents. You look them up and draw them out. I know it's difficult to navigate because some of the items that we've looked into, the Lincoln arm, the hanger arm, the Palmer leg, these prosthetics can be kind of hard to find, even if we know the patent number that they are. So I think certainly, yeah, that would be a good place to look if you want to do a scale model of a ambulance wagon. That might be a good place to start. I know that there are smaller models of ambulance wagon that you can find, but for 1/6, you probably need to draft your own based on the originals.
Yeah, that patent idea is an interesting one, and yes, you're spot on, Kyle. The Google patents, whatever it is very kind of bizarre, but also really good and really helpful if you know how to attack it. Well, to the extent that someone can know how to attack that. Anyway, great idea, Jen. Let me see here. Oh, and Drew says, thanks for the Studebaker info. I will be going to the Studebaker Museum in South Bend, Indiana to do more research. So very exciting. Get back to us, Drew, and let us know how it goes.
Yeah.
Janice asked, did the ambulances do more harm than good in this sense? I think they were unsprung and were often driven over rutted roads. What was the experience like of a wounded soldier in a Civil War ambulance?
It is not good. She's not wrong. So they are sprung. Sometimes you'll see in the diagrams too that like they're exaggerated over what they would be for, say, a standard supply wagon. And that's one of the complaints you see in the Confederacy too, is they have wagons, but they have a lack of ambulance wagons. And that creates a pretty nasty atmosphere. However, that spring is not enough. And you're constantly seeing in the primary records these poor wounded men just being thrown into the roof of the wagon, jostled about, thrown off of where they're laying down. I mean, it's pretty nasty stuff. And sometimes I've seen this anecdote more than once from different sources, people talking about the wounded begging to be just left on the side of the road to die. Now, having said that, that is absolutely true. It is awful to actually be in one of these things if you're grievously wounded. Doing more harm than good is a little trickier to nail down. We know for certain that medical evacuation was key in survivability, even if it wasn't great medical evacuation. The Confederacy, as I said, didn't really ever emphasize it. There were some start and stop efforts in the South on a smaller scale. And there were a couple of times where the Confederate Congress introduced a bill that would create something like an ambulance system. Both of those bills were vetoed. One of those bills was passed, but they changed it to cut out everything about the ambulance corps. So they never really got to that. And local efforts were never as strong as they would be in the North, local commands, that is. And that is probably the primary reason for the higher mortality rate of Confederate wounded over Union wounded. Even so, definitely there are people who are being horribly handled in these ambulances. And a lot of that came down to driver training and expectations. Late in the war, there's a nurse, a woman who volunteers to be an ambulance driver because they're running short. And she writes about riding over this road and realizing it was much smoother than she expected it to be. So with the permission of the wounded in her wagon, she whips the horses and just gallops down this road at full speed. And the thing that makes this relevant is the other ambulance drivers are yelling at her to slow down, that she's killing her patients. The patients were all fine. One of them actually like kind of backed her up on that. told this driver who had yelled at her to quiet down or he would smell some powder. But again, these drivers had experience by that point. I think this was 1864. They learned that, hey, we got to take it real easy on these roads or our patients aren't going to handle it well. It's something that comes with experience and with training. And that's something that the Ambulance Corps introduces. There are ambulances in the US before the Civil War, but they're not organized and they're not trained.
Fascinating. Changing topics a little bit here. We got a question from someone asking, did the Army of the Cumberland have its own ambulance corps? And one of the questions that I was kind of wondering about is, what difference have you uncovered, if there was one, between Eastern and Western theaters, both Union and Confederate? So I'm curious if you could speak to that.
Yeah, I'll start with the second one because I think I've got notes here. Yes, I am pretty sure this is it. Yes. So the Army of the Cumberland did have an ambulance corps. I think, but I'm not sure, that it was inspired by Dr. Letterman's ambulance corps. We know that they had an ambulance corps because in 1864, January 1st, 1864, there were orders issued for a special uniform for the Army of the Cumberland's ambulance corps. They wore red stripes on their upper arm, not a chevron, just a stripe all the way across. And they had a red band around their hat with a red knot on one side, a cockade. So these red symbols were supposed to show them as these are the guys that you need to call to you to pick you up. I assume it was kind of like reflective vests on EMTs today. If you're in the field and you see them, you can wave them down. Because in the Army of the Potomac, they used almost the same uniform except green being the color of the medical department. So we know the Army of the Cumberland had an ambulance corps. What its organization and training looked like and its selection process, I haven't really found anything on that. I just know that they had one. As for medical evacuation in the Western Theater, it is not as well organized as it is in the East, at least not at first. It's really the Army of the Potomac that kind of sets the standard for how this can work efficiently. And after that, it's nationalized. I mentioned this earlier, but in 1864, Congress passed the Ambulance Corps Act. And one of the big guys pushing for that was Dr. Henry Bowditch. He's the son of the famous navigator, Nathaniel Bowditch from New England. Henry Bowditch lost his son in the war. He was mortally wounded on the field at Kelly's Ford. And Henry Bowditch pushes for this, and he writes a pamphlet about have we the best ambulance corps? That's literally the title, have we the best ambulance corps? And he argues for why it should be adopted nationally. It's a very influential pamphlet, seems to have done the job. 64, they pass it. And at that point, the Western Theater is forced by Congress to institute a system that is almost word for word what Dr. Letterman had done in the Army of the Potomac. The only difference at that point, 1864, between the Eastern Theater and the Western Theater is that in the Eastern Theater, the ambulance corps were ordered to carry firearms, and in the Western Theater, they were not. The Congress took the orders that Letterman wrote and just copied them, just word for word, verbatim. The only thing they cut out was a requirement for firearms. I'm not sure why exactly. My guess is that they probably weren't carrying them anyway. There's a lot of writing in the few sources that we have of the stretcher bearers and ambulance drivers of the Army of the Potomac saying that they turned in their guns when they joined the ambulance corps, and none of them say they were assigned any. So it seems to indicate that these guys weren't carrying anyway. They just kind of ignored that part of the orders. And Congress probably did the same thing. If your stretcher bearer is armed, it makes him look like a combatant. So probably that's why it got cut out. But that seems to be the only difference in 1864 between the two sides, between East and West, is that Western ones started with the idea that they would never carry firearms.
Yeah, that was also going to be sort of my take on that as well, is that the Lieber Code comes out in 1863, which starts to set some standards in terms of combatants, non-combatants, and things of that nature. And so I wonder if Congress taking that into consideration, maybe said, maybe they shouldn't have guns since this is like a law as opposed to, a military order or something. And then the other thing that came to my mind, and just some of the research that I've done with battles in the Western theater, the other thing that um, an organization like the ambulance corps would have to contend with out west that isn't as much of an issue in the east is just things are just so much further apart out west. I mean, some of these battlefields, I mean, few, if any, Civil War battles are fought, in the middle of like a city with, where you're surrounded by structures where the wounded can be cared for. So, I mean, a lot of Civil War battlefields happen, out in fields, places, but in the East, there's just such a greater rail network. Everything's closer together. Out West, I'm thinking of a few battles, a place like Wilson's Creek or Pea Ridge. It's over 100 miles to the closest railhead, which is where after soldiers are treated in field hospitals, they're sent to for long-term recovery, and they would more often than not take ambulances to get to the railhead to get back. And so anyway, that's, I think, just an added complication out west.
It gets even more exaggerated when you go to the far west, when you're looking at the Southwestern campaign, when Sibley tries to invade Arizona and New Mexico. There's ambulance wagons that accompany his force out of Texas, but there's not that many of them, and you can't really repair them on these vast distances. They end up abandoning after Sibley's defeated at Glorieta Pass and is retreating to Texas. There's a very moving moment when they abandon all their sick and wounded. They just leave them at a camp with an ambulance wagon. They raise a hospital flag over it. They leave them there with a fire and with some rations. They're just like, we can't take care of you. We know the Union will. And they just leave. But that, again, sort of exaggerates what's true of the Western theater in general. The far Western theater, there's even less of that. There's much wider distances. We're talking about hundreds of miles on a campaign. So as you say, yeah, it's very different depending on where you are as to what kind of care you get.
Well, and I see that we've sort of anticipated Dave's question here. What was the average distance of ambulance transport? And our answer is it depends on where you are. Generally, of course, there's exceptions to all this, but generally speaking, in the Eastern theater, it's a little bit shorter, and it progressively gets longer the further west you go.
And it's true also as you go further south.
Sure.
When you're looking at operations in the Carolinas, if you're at the Siege of Charleston, well, it's just over the ridge. It's just beyond gunfire. But if you're going into the swamps, if you're on your campaigns down there or in Florida, like Olustee Station is a good example, sometimes there's no ambulances at all, even if you are the U.S. So it does vary widely depending on where you're fighting. For the most famous campaigns, your Gettysburgs, your Antietam's, what have you, your general hospital, your field hospital is usually just a couple of miles behind the lines. But for these other conflicts, it can get a lot more complicated.
And this is also something that we're kind of circling here. Jan asks, were whole ambulances ever put on, quote unquote, on the cars on a railroad flatbed to expedite transport? I think the answer is no, and that the armies favored just regular railroad transportation, either a boxcar with straw in the bottom, or eventually purpose-built hospital train cars do get developed. But I don't know, Kyle, maybe you can speak to that.
I wouldn't be surprised if there was a case of ambulance wagons being transported by rail, especially if you're shifting between theaters. But as we see here, ambulances often unloaded their wounded at the train cars. This one is pretty explicit about it. It also gives us a very rare glimpse of a different kind of evacuation, the horse stretcher. Oops, let's zoom in on that a little. It won't let me. Okay. But you can see here that the horse has these two sort of bassinets on either side, which can also be removed. And the foreground is an example of that. These appear to have been abandoned by about halfway through the war. It jostles a lot. But usually you would take the wounded to the train. They would be unloaded onto the train, and then the ambulances would go back to the Army. This also keeps the ambulances available for the Army in case they need them at short notice. Often in the accounts of ambulance drivers and stretcher bearers, they talk about riding their wagons between cities, which again suggests, at least within the theater, that they're not using rail transportation to move the ambulances. Again, I think if you're shifting forces, which sometimes happens both north and south between major theaters like the Western Theater and the Eastern Theater, then I could definitely see them putting them on trains to keep them up with the rest of the Army. But I just haven't come across any sources of that. I also haven't looked for it. So I'm not going to discount it. I'm just saying I haven't seen it yet.
Let's see. Beth asks, and again, you were sort of getting to this here. Beth asks, were the ambulances utilized to move injured during the battle to an aid station and or hospital, or were they simply utilized to move patients after a battle? So when are the ambulances in action, I guess? I mean, it's certainly after the battle, but to what extent were they active during the battle?
They were very active during the battle. They were constantly shifting people. Generally speaking, from point of wounding to field dressing station, again, the first two steps of the Letterman system for the North anyway, it's stretcher bearers. They're usually not riding ambulances up to the fighting. That's what the stretcher bearers are doing. They're going in, they're grabbing people, they're getting out. They make much less of a target, and they aren't mistaken that way for munitions wagons. They aren't mistaken for legitimate targets. They're usually mistaken for that anyway behind the lines. So why expose them to any more of that? But the stretcher bearers are the ones who are running them back and forth between point of wounding and field dressing station. Once you get to the field dressing station, that's where first aid happens. That's where the bandaging is being done. That's where drugs are being administered, perhaps minor surgery. They're stabilizing the patients and they're performing triage. They're keeping people there to do a little more work on them. They're sending people back to the front. And if they're badly wounded enough, that's when they get on the ambulance wagon. Generally speaking, that's your point of contact. However, these ambulance wagons are traveling the same routes that all other wagons are using. Again, legitimate targets, munitions wagons, which to a distant eye, say an artillery piece, you're not going to be able to tell, oh, well, that's a Rucker-style ambulance wagon instead of the munitions wagon. And to muddy things up, sometimes people were using ambulance wagons as munitions wagons, getting ammunition to the front. So they're firing on them all the time in that space. Tends to be long distance, but generally speaking, that's where point of contact is happening for ambulances in battle. There are other times where ambulances are in supply trains as a whole, and they're ambushed. This happens at, what's the, after the Battle of Gettysburg, it's on the Appalachian Trail, actually. Union Cavalry rides into a supply column for the Army of Northern Virginia.
Falling Waters or
Bethlehem something, Jerusalem something.
Could be.
It's Christmas season. I may just get my wires crossed.
Yeah, it could be.
Anyway, that happens. There's Confederate ambulances, many of them presumably stolen Union wagons, that are captured by Kilpatrick and his cavalry. And the opposite happens a couple of times to Union supply trains with ambulances. So they are involved in combat. They are involved in active combat, either because that's just what they have to do during the battle, or because they're part of a supply train and they're in the wrong place at the wrong time.
Speaking of horses, Tim asked what breed or breeds of horses did the hospital corps use on both sides, or even if there was a preference?
I haven't come across any specific references to breeds, except for mules are sometimes used. You get that every now and then. I have seen also references. There's a Confederate surgeon who commandeers a horse from a Union ambulance that was captured. He said it was a very fine horse, but that's as specific as I've found, is a very fine horse. And how he defines that is up to him, and he doesn't go any further. Yeah, we don't know about specific breeds. We do know they use both horses and mules. That's unfortunately as much as we can say.
Got it. Well, as we're coming to the end of our time here, we'd be remiss if we didn't bring up, how this story and how, all this research on ambulances and such, how it impacts us today.
Yeah, that's and that is the point of our museum. It's in our mission statement to make sure that we understand how the medical story of the Civil War affects us now, what we can learn from that. What we can say is there's a very direct line between the ambulances of the Civil War and emergency medical treatment today. The very first civilian ambulance wagons were founded in 1866 in Cincinnati and in New York City. Both of them were founded by former officers of the ambulance corps. In Cincinnati, it was Good Samaritan Hospital. In New York, it was Bellevue Hospital. And both of these still operate to this day. So the very first civilian ambulances in the U.S. came immediately after the war from this system directly. Anytime you see an ambulance going down the street, anytime you've had to ride an ambulance, that is a very straight line from the innovations of Dr. Letterman, of the U.S. Medical Department, of the men who drove these wagons and carried these stretchers. So there is a very straight line to today, and it's important that we continue to remember that and explore that story. That's, again, one of the reasons that we're asking for your help. If you would like to give, check out the description or the pinned comment for supporting our effort to restore a reproduction Rucker ambulance wagon. And be sure to swing by Pry House Field Hospital Museum to see it in person sometime once we're back open there.
Which hopefully should be this coming spring. Yes, so if you're able to, please give to help keep our ambulance rolling. As Kyle said, link in the comments and in the video description. Thank you so much for joining us today. A lot of great questions today. I know I had a good time. I hope you had a good time out there joining us today. Thank you so much for tuning in. So support us if you can to restore the ambulance, but an easy, great, free way to support us is to subscribe to our YouTube channel. If you haven't already done so, subscribe to our YouTube channel and like the video. That's easy, simple, and free way that you can help support us. I'll be back next week, next Thursday. I'm going to be talking with Dr. Jim Downs about his latest book, Maladies of Empire. It should be a really engaging conversation. I'm looking forward to it. So looking forward to talking with Dr. Downs and hopefully responding to some of your questions there as well. But until then, this is Kyle and I signing off. Thank you so much.